This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and the issue of what is happening with accountability and the corruption of the government is an important issue for working people. And working people, particularly in fighting for health and safety on the job, have discovered that, in fact, even though we have OSHA and other agencies which were established to protect health and safety on the job, workers find out that they're not getting the protection they deserve. And as we know, there are a whole series of explosions, train derailments, aircraft accidents that threaten, chemical explosions that threaten the health and safety of the workers and communities. And joining us today is Darrel Whitman. Darrel, an investigator with OSHA, Whistleblower Protection Program, and his job was to investigate complaints of workers who felt that they'd been retaliated against for making health and safety complaints. And he was required to make a determination whether or not they had been fired, retaliated against for those OSHA complaints. And in the course of that, he came up against a management and a system really that wanted him not to do his job. And in that conflict, he was retaliated against himself and joined with other whistleblowers in both the public and private employment. So welcome to our show, Darrel.
Glad to be back with you, Steve.
Darrel, when you began this job with the U.S. government at the Whistleblower Protection Program as an investigator, you're also a lawyer, you thought that you would be basically just protecting workers who had health and safety issues, and that would be to the betterment of the workers and our society.
Yes, it's called the Whistleblower Protection Program, and I thought that was what I was going to be doing. But as many things that you're going to see, and I think people are beginning to be aware of this, what's in a name doesn't necessarily describe what is actually going on. Over the years, and more recently, and looking critically at the development of the Whistleblower Protection Program, it was dead on arrival in the sense that it was never intended to work. And after it was first created in 1970-71 as part of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, it was simply a tool for the bureaucrats who ran the department to use for their purposes. And it was very controversial. People actually who were involved in the program in the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of them left because they were watching this happen and they had joined a program because they thought it was going to do the job of improving the protection of workers in the workplace. And that simply was not going on. And after that, it became a political football. Congress loves to claim that it's doing this and it's doing that. We're going to pass this law. We're going to do this oversight. We're going to conduct this study or whatever. But most of that is just basically politicized rhetoric. If anybody actually takes the time to look at the recent history, what is the collapse of Congress and the capture of the administrative state, which is what we call the executive branch of government. And both of them are thoroughly under the control of corporate interests.
And you discovered that in trying to pursue these studies that you did of workers who had been retaliated against. And one of them, Michael Madry, he was a whistleblower at Air America who found out that the tests that they were doing at Hunters Point, Treasure Island, were improper. They were having tests that were 100% negative when there was asbestos in the soil.
It's interesting because if you actually walked out to Hunters Point, the site itself, what you would see if you looked around, kicked the dirt a little bit, there's serpentine there. It's green and it's fibrous. It is basic ore for asbestos. So asbestos is actually a naturally occurring substance. It's not manufactured, taken out of the ground. The idea that somehow there was no asbestos out there, even when they originally did Hunters Point, the shipyard, they were aware that the asbestos was there.
And of course, that shipyard was used as a testing ground for radiation. They had an animal testing ground for how animals were affected. They tested the workers, mostly black
Right.
workers, gave them radioactive material to see how they would react. There's a whole series of cancers and toxins that people have in the shipyard who worked at the shipyard, also
Right.
community members
Right.
in that shipyard. And Michael, he was one of the first whistleblowers to find out that, in fact, there was a cover-up going on and that these companies were supposed to doing remediation or testing were, in fact, falsifying the tests.
Exactly. Yes. And that went on. Actually, the project at Hunters Point started back in the 1990s. If you think about who was running the city and county of San Francisco at that point, it will explain what's going on now and what was going on then. They were decommissioning a lot of these military installations, not only Hunters Point, but Treasure Island and all across the bay in Oakland. All of these were being shut down in the early 1990s. What that meant was people who had a strong economic interest in the development of these places were rushing to take them so they could build luxury apartments and all this other stuff on these sites. Almost every military base is a toxic waste dump, almost by definition. And people who were in the military or people who worked around Hunters Point, I think the ILWU was aware of all this contamination because a lot of the dock workers were working around and with other people who were working in and around Hunters Point. I had heard that in the 1970s, the problem with the contamination at Hunters Point.
And they brought ships that had been used in nuclear blasts in the Marshall Islands.
Right.
They were towed from the Marshall Islands to Hunters Point to see if they would be usable after a nuclear war. So it was
It
a
wasn't
testing
just
ground. So a lot of waste and that kind of thing. But the idea that they brought these radioactive ships, towed them to San Francisco, to Hunters Point, and then they had workers sandblasting them, putting the nuclear waste, the radioactive waste in the soil throughout the community. And they were testing animals at Hunters Point. It was a radiation dump site. As a result of that, large numbers of people got cancer. And also Treasure Island was a naval testing center for nuclear warfare. And they had a ship called the Pandemonium, where they used live radioactive material on the ship with the sailors to see
Yep.
how they would take care of radioactive waste. And of course, the radioactive waste went in on the island, which is now, when you come back, you'll see has been developed, and they have high rises on the island, and they say it's safe. And actually, I know a planner who was brought there by Willie Brown to do a survey of the viability of the island for development. There's
Yeah.
a great view of San Francisco. And she and her co-worker actually came to the conclusion that it was a very unsafe place because it's a man-made island, and there would be massive liquefaction if there was an earthquake
Right.
on that island, since it was man-made.
Yep.
They were shunted aside and retaliated against when they made that report. They went ahead with developing it, even though people were getting sick on that island, continued to get sick and contaminated, and they found radioactive material. This case with Michael Madry, I think, illuminated like what is happening. And Lennar became the builder at Hunters Point, and Dianne Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi, whose cousin worked for Lennar in the government relations of Lennar, were instrumental in coercing the Navy to turn it over to the city for development. And there's a Brownfield Act where developers throughout the United States were said that if you take these properties that are contaminated, you will promise to clean them up. And so they're clean and safe, and then you can develop them. And then we have Downey, California, another polluted site, which was a military industrial complex that people were getting sick at the Downey studios. And they built a Kaiser Hospital on a polluted site, a dangerous site. So it seems like it's an epidemic of health and safety issues at these sites around the United States, not just
Right. Technically, OSHA Act was born in the late 1960s when there was a growing awareness that, hey, there's toxic waste sites all over the place. And so that was an act passed by Congress, actually watered down from the original proposals, that was supposed to satisfy the public's concern without actually doing anything. Once it became clear, a lot of the people that joined OSHA in the first 5, 8 years, they came in because they thought it was going to do that. And then by the late 1970s, it became clear that wasn't happening. And in fact, the whole ideology of the OSHA management shifted from being a regulatory agency trying to identify and protect the workers on these sites. It became an agency captured by the corporate interests it was supposed to regulate. And what's interesting is if you ask an OSHA manager today, and I asked several of them, they will protest that OSHA is not a regulatory agency. So they're giving away the fact that somewhere along the line, OSHA lost its soul.
And I just returned from a trip to on the second anniversary, and Vice President Vance was there actually talking about how we have to move on. It's been 2 years since the incident, so we really can't take care of the health care of the residents and the workers there. Members of the CDC and EPA who were sent there got sick from the vinyl chloride and other chemicals that were ignited. And he said that we had to move on. We couldn't declare it a Stafford Act. One of the things he said is, well, we have to finish the cleanup. And what the residents were saying, first of all, the workers themselves who are involved in the cleanup are getting sick. George Thompson has patients who have been contaminated as a result of working in that East Palestine. But the fact that there's no oversight, even of the cleanup of this highly toxic chemical waste, basically let it rip. It's the Wild West. You contaminate a community, you blow up, you ignite illegally, ignite these chemicals, 23 tanker cars, blow it up. A plume covers like 3 states, 4 states, thousands, tens of thousands of people are contaminated, and you just move on. But OSHA is nowhere to be found.
They're meeting with their corporate benefactors. That's what's going on. I mean, one of the things I wasn't surprised, but it was disturbing to find was the direct relationships between these corporations and OSHA. They're literally the senior officials from OSHA are going to work for the corporate people that they were supposed to be regulating, in fact. And this is just a way of corrupting the program. And let me explain one thing that probably very few people understand. In 1978, during the corporatization period under Jimmy Carter, there was what was called the Civil Service Reform Act. It was the most massive reorganization of the federal government since this other committee, the Pendleton Committee, back in the 1880s. So this is a massive project to redesign the federal government, and it got almost no public coverage, in part because we had an impeachment going on, we had a crisis in the Middle East, we had hyperinflation, and we had the hostages in Tehran to keep us occupied. As this massive piece of legislation was put on the books, and I have a copy of the hearings for one part of it, which was the Inspector General Act. Now, a lot of people don't have any real idea what the inspectors general were. But in fact, that particular part of this massive piece of legislation was put in basically to water down the capacity of Congress to actually oversee programs. Because we had at the time the General Accounting Office, it's an agency within the administrative state, but it works for Congress. when Congress wants an audit, Congress wants an investigation, they go to the GAO, who has all the trained people and the procedures and all that, and they would go and conduct these audits and investigations. Actually, up until the Inspector General Act, there was no criticism of GAOs doing the job. The problem was that's an arm of Congress. You might get people in there who have this idea that they're representing the public. Can't have that. So let's create another bureaucracy and take the power away from Congress to audit and investigate. And that's what's happened.
And you had some personal experience with that because as a
Yes,
result of your work, carrying out your work
yes,
as an investigator at OSHA, you were retaliated against and fired. You and other people in your office, Region 9 of OSHA
right.
in San Francisco, they were virtually shut down, fired most of the people. And you took up the long, arduous struggle to follow through in appeals of your retaliation. And you came to the labor secretary who was supposed to do an investigation of your firing. And who was that? That was the
Yep. Thomas E. Perez, soon to become the chair of the Democrat Party.
and what happened with him? Because apparently he did not want an investigation of what happened to you.
They had it all set up. And now that I've had a chance to look at a much broader swath of the federal government, this is a pattern in many agencies. Everybody was aware that the program was corrupt, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. In fact, one of my colleagues said, I think we may be doing more harm than good. Being investigators. And the reality is, if you look at the program, the investigators, the only thing we're supposed to do is establish whether or not there's reason to believe that the report is more likely than not true. That's a very low standard of proof. And there's all these different statutes that say, oh, you're supposed to do it in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and 180 days. But the reality is, OSHA, 80% of the time, they never meet their statutes. Why? Because they do not train the investigators that this is the process. You only need to establish whether or not there's more reason to believe that it's a very low standard.
And
And
that's
then,
a merit determination,
yes,
which is allows the worker to get his job back and compensation for being retaliated.
exactly.
Yes.
That's the way it's structured. But of course, that's what the whistleblower protection part is supposed to be about. But in fact, what they do, they manipulate the investigation and they manipulate the investigators, most of whom are not lawyers, most of whom have no actual training in law. And this is supposed to be a legally bounded investigation. So let's hire a lot of people who don't know what they're doing. And then we'll manipulate them, and they won't realize that they're being manipulated. But there's no reason, there's occasionally, once in a while, you run into a situation where you just can't quite meet that deadline. But that's the exception. That should be maybe 5% of the cases at most, instead of 95% of the cases. And because they're really trying to persuade the investigator and the complainant that what's being investigated is like the FBI does to develop allegations that can be brought to court for criminal activity, et cetera, et cetera. That's not true at all.
And many of the workers that you have come in touch with, and I have talked with Becky McLean, who was a Pfizer molecular biologist, Ashley Govic, who was worked
Right.
for Apple. They actually discovered that OSHA was in collusion with
Yes.
managers, with their bosses at Apple and
Yep.
Pfizer, and providing documents of their cases to these companies to help the
Yep.
companies against the workers. Is this unusual or is this a
This
common?
is no, that's common. That's really the most common pattern that you run into. And of course, what Sawali was saying about actually doing harm is what was happening, and still, I think it still must still be going on. When people file complaints, technically their identities are not supposed to be revealed. It's supposed to be regarded as a safe channel for people to come and report and then trigger an investigation that will establish more likely than not. And then it's supposed to be handed over to, if it's the railroad, to the National Railroad Administration, or if it's highways, to the Department of Transportation. It's supposed to be a gatekeeping function, in effect, which protects the whistleblower, but also provides a way of screening out de minimis kinds of stuff, really small stuff, or really questionable allegations. But then it's supposed to be given to the agency to conduct thorough investigations and hold people accountable. That's not happening. In fact, OSHA is ensuring that it doesn't happen. And
And yet, and
that's
yet,
not my opinion. That's the opinion of 6 federal audits conducted between 2008 and 2020, repeatedly. And the last audit said, this is worse than the last audit. No investigations, though. No investigations of OSHA. No investigations of the investigations. We got to keep that covered up.
you tried to get an investigation, and of course, Nancy Pelosi, who was a proponent of the development of Hunters Point and Treasure Island, and Feinstein and the Democratic Party, the head of the Democratic Party, Tom Perez, was in
Yeah.
charge of the Labor Department. And you went to them and tried to get an investigation. They refused to do that.
They didn't refuse. What they did was Tom Perez tasked the investigation to OSHA to conduct, and OSHA had neither the investigators nor the authority to conduct an investigation.
That was
And
Tom
when I
Perez. Yeah.
I reported that to the Inspector General, DOL was the agency that obstructed the investigation. They are there to protect the senior bureaucrats and senior political appointees.
And one of the things that is happening today is that the Trump administration said that we have to get rid of the deep state. The deep state is obstructing justice but apparently in the removal of inspector generals throughout the United States, which they've done, they kept Michael Horowitz as an inspector
Well,
general.
yes, and that's the measure. The American public does not know how the government works. And there's nothing in the mainstream media is going to tell you how it works, because that's the whole deal. We got to keep the public distracted. We got to keep them propagandized. So if they ever learned what was going on, there would be a revolt.
There may be a revolt anyway,
Yes, there may be
because
a
what they're
revolt
doing
anyway.
is revolutionary, radical revolutionary to attack.
It is. It is. And I'm neither a supporter or a critic of Donald Trump. He's just another guy. He's just another corporate executive running the government.
And the thing about your struggle took place, and other whistleblowers, the Whistleblowers United, the group that you formed of whistleblowers in the federal government and private employers, came to the conclusion that there needed to be a congressional investigation, and
Absolutely.
that there should be oversight through a congressional investigation. And this, of course, did not happen during the Democratic administration of Obama. And then you had a Republican administration. There was an effort, you filed the lawsuit, and also there was effort to have a congressional investigation by the Republicans, who say they want to fight corruption and waste and malfeasance. What happened?
Actually, this is interesting. I stumbled upon it when I was doing some research. There's a report that was done in 2006. It was done by Norman Ornstein, who I believe is a Republican and a Democrat. They're both academics. They're the designated specialists on the American government. And they produced it for one of these think tanks, but it was very critical. 2006, and it's titled The Broken Branch. Congress is a broken branch. And this is not, again, some radical critique. This is actually from the mainstream academics who are supposed to be giving us the inside information. So since 2006, it's clear Congress is broken. Has there been any real discussion in the public mainstream media about it? No.
You went to Barbara Lee, who's
Yes.
now running for mayor of Oakland.
Oh, she is.
Yeah, she's running for mayor of Oakland now and is going to clean up and solve the problems. But you went to her office with
Yes.
information of retaliation against you
Well,
and others.
what I did, I became the AFGE representative to the San Francisco Central Labor Council. And after that happened, I got to know a lot of the union stewards in the DOL. A lot of good people there, not necessarily well trained in their jobs, but really put their heart and soul into trying to be good stewards. So I was getting a lot of reports back from different stewards about the corruption in the Department of Labor generally. And one of the big issues was the Department of Labor was retaliating against people with disabilities. But it was true. I talked to a lot of them. It was absolutely true. I interviewed several people. And
in your office, there were
yeah,
lawyers with disabilities who themselves were being retaliated against,
yes, exactly.
and whistleblower protection program workers.
We couldn't resolve it. The union couldn't resolve it in the DOL through the ordinary procedures, union procedures. I decided, let me go over and talk to Barbara Lee's office. And I talked to one of her representatives, one of her AAs, not AAs, legislative assistants, really nice person. And I said, I'm here to talk about, I'm a union rep, and I'm here to talk about what's going on with the Department of Labor in San Francisco. They're running roughshod over people with disabilities. And I was surprised because she was very honest. And we had to leave Barbara Lee's office and go down to the corner of the hallway to have the conversation. That was her choice. Let's get out of the office and I'll tell you what's going on. So what she told me was they had been receiving reports of this for a couple of years. And Barbara Lee had done zip, nothing to protect her constituents, her federal employee constituents. But it wasn't just Barbara Lee. She said Nancy Pelosi's office is right there in the same building. And the other, I can't remember her name. I don't think she's in Congress anymore, down the peninsula. They all have federal employees, quite a large number of them. And they all have been receiving the same reports. 3 different members of Congress, no action, no even acknowledgement of the problem. What? I stayed in touch with this particular member of her staff, and we would exchange because she was concerned about it as well. And then we had a longer conversation in 2013 about what was going on. And she says, my fiance and I are going to leave the United States. The corruption is so bad. And what I'm seeing here is just unbelievable. So we decided that we're going to leave the country. You can't make this stuff up. And then she went on to say that her own office had been under surveillance. The employees in Barbara Lee's office were under surveillance because all these reports were coming out and they wanted to be sure that none of it got out into the public.
And you also tried to pursue this. You were a delegate to the San Francisco Labor Council, which passed a resolution against your termination, that in fact you should be reinstated because of your work. You were retaliated against. You were not only a OSHA investigator and lawyer, but also a whistleblower and a delegate to the Labor Council in AFSCME. And you also tried to get action by AFSCME, which now is under
Right.
attack. And you went to the president of AFSCME, in fact.
Yes. Yes, I did. And he sent somebody,
That was
yeah,
caught.
Brother Cox. Yes, I remember Brother Cox. And of course, that was bottled up. Nothing ever came out of that. And the irony is, this is not what I'm reporting is not just an opinion. It's not an impression. It's a documented facts. If you went into court with these facts, it would take about 30 minutes to get a conviction. A lot of these are documents directly written by federal senior officials, basically statements against admissions against interest, basically admitting what they were doing, that they were retaliating against federal employees.
And Cox, you tried to get him to deal with it. Here's a member of his union, an
Right?
officer, a local officer who's been retaliated against, been fired. Other members of AFSCME have been retaliated against, fired. You tried to get some action, some traction with the national union to defend the members
Yep.
here. What happened?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know that once I did one thing that did happen. The letter that I wrote to him was published in Washington, D.C. by one of the conservative newspapers. I forget what
The Examiner?
no, it was a real serious Republican publication. It's still around, it still does a lot of publications. But yet, even with that, it was absolutely dead silent. Dead silent. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm out here in Region 9. We represent basically about 10% or less of the employees, OSHA employees, and it's a regional office. And we're seeing this. Well, what's going on with the rest of the country? And then I went to a conference, an OSHA conference in Orlando, and met a lot of people from the other parts of the country. And I was stunned to learn how bad it was. We had attorney investigators, and we were hired specifically because this audit in 2008 it said OSHA is a completely failed program, and it's been failed for 20 years. And so there was a bit of a panic. Maybe the public might get a little upset if they found out this is a failure that's been going on for 20 years. So they ran around, they hired me and my colleagues, who are all attorneys, to come in. And of course, then they turned around and attacked us, destroyed our lives, our careers, and eventually booted us out of the agency.
Because you were trying to do your job.
Yeah, that was really the amazing part. Every single one of the attorneys I worked with, and I have no idea what their politics were, other than they all became very much sympathetic to the union. All of them, we all came to the same conclusion independently. Now, when you have 5 people working in a project independently, because we investigate cases independently, we don't, collaborate with other attorneys in the office, and they're all coming to the same conclusion. What does that say?
And you did this investigation of Michael Madry. You made it a mere determination that
Yes.
indeed he had been retaliated against because of making a complaint around the health and safety of these tests to his company, Air America. And what happened after you did that?
After I did that, the problem is that this is a lot worse than people probably will believe, because it's not just a matter of denying, the investigation and firing me and two of my colleagues, and they go after people. And this is not just Mike's story, it's the story of a number of the whistleblowers. The ones who had high profile cases would have visit from the local sheriff's department. They would have their homes burglarized, their computers smashed. They would have their planes and cars sabotaged. Maybe they ended up dead. This is really organized crime. It's as much organized crime as the Gambino family because they kill people. They do kill people.
And some
And
of the whistleblowers that you were in touch with were, in fact, killed.
yes, and that was maybe the most chilling discovery of the last now almost 10 years I've been working on this, is that these people have no conscience at all. And why? Because they've developed this protection network. They will not be accountable for anything that they do. And this protection network extends to the highest levels of the United States Senate. That's what we learned. So we
And
have a
what was the
criminal.
role of the inspector generals? They prevented inspections in these agencies?
What they did was they would shut down because the inspector general is the kind of local policeman in the agency, and they would determine they have complete authority to either investigate or not investigate, to conduct an audit or not conduct an audit. So the investigations they were conducting were politicized. They were going after people that they considered threats to them in the agency. And that went as high as the Secretary of Labor, that they actually weaponized the IG in the Department of Labor to investigate and to force the resignation of this particular secretary because he wasn't one of their team. This is a criminal government.
And
And
this is, some people have said, this is the deep state.
the state is the state.
I mean,
Deep is everywhere.
the deep state seems to be representing the corporate interests. Deep state, whether it's the state or the deep state, aren't they both really representing the people who are running the U.S.?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, again, when I went back and began to look at the history of this thing, we've had this problem for a long time. In fact, I tracked it back to almost the beginnings of the Republic at one point. Corruption in government has been a theme of American history going back to what was the name of the guy, vice president that wanted to take over Florida and set himself up as king or whatever it was. And then he went out and he shot and killed Alexander Hamilton because Hamilton was onto his case. This is a problem with corruption that goes back to the beginning of the Republic. And it's in spite of the enormous tragedies that have occurred as a consequence, they'll clean them up for a little while. This is a deeply systemic problem. And it's only gotten worse over the years. The other thing that I actually gathered these directly from the audits, between 2009 and present, there's been probably somewhere 110,000 whistleblowers who have been attacked and destroyed and prevented from, and their reports of health, safety, and financial security threats have been covered up. Over 100,000 in the last 15 years.
And these are both Democrats, Republicans, people who believed in accountability, basically.
I can have political differences with someone without necessarily both of us, one or the other, abandoning the idea we have to have accountability. The two things that make a government credible are transparency. So we know what's going on, and we certainly don't know what's going on. And the second is accountability. So when something goes south, there's an investigation into people who have used the position in violation of law. These people are held accountable. That's the two things that are required, and neither of them is happening.
And you had the case of Obama, who went to Texas after the explosion at that chemical plant. And Texas has 100 OSHA investigators. It's under the federal jurisdiction of
Right,
OSHA.
right.
So it's not the state, it's the federal government. And he goes to this chemical plant and to remember the workers and the people in the community who were killed, and doesn't mention the fact that the US government is responsible for health
More
and safety
importantly,
of the chemical plants.
Steve, Obama was the senator that blocked OSHA going into these plants, one in West Texas. He blocked it as a senator so that OSHA was not held accountable for not showing up and checking out what was going on there for over 20 years. When everybody in the area knew that they were piling on this fertilizer in the mountains and it was dangerous and it was illegal, 20 years that went on until finally one day it blew half the town off the map. That's
And
the
it seems that this breakdown of transparency, this breakdown of accountability by corporate capture is leading to massive incidents. Like there have been over 1,500 derailments since East Palestine.
right.
So they're continuing to operate recklessly. Norfolk Southern companies,
Business
the
as usual.
airlines, Boeing, the systemic things, and then attacking the workers, the air traffic controllers, and
Right.
blaming them for the fact that they're overworked and that they can't properly supervise. It seems like a breakdown of the whole system. And the
Well,
function.
I'm not sure it's a breakdown. I think that is the system. It's not breaking down. That is the system.
So these
And
disasters that are
and
taking place.
I say that particularly with regard to Boeing and the 737 MAX, is they had lots of people inside of Boeing who knew about the problems with that plane, and they tried to report them. And they got no traction with reporting it. And then at the end, after 300 and some people were killed in those two accidents within a 6 or 8 months, whatever it was, the FAA had decided that they were going to make an agreement with Boeing. Boeing could self-regulate.
Now
That's
that
right.
sounds like a good solution. You put the
Oh,
good the
wonderful.
companies in to self-regulate themselves
You
after
don't
they're
have,
blowing up.
you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see what's going on here.
And there was just a bill introduced today by a congressperson to completely abolish OSHA.
Actually, I'm not sure that's a bad idea because what they're doing is they're providing cover for a corrupt system. You take OSHA away, and then you can't get some bureaucrat to come up and stand at the podium and say, we're really concerned about this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. OSHA is thoroughly corrupt. And if it's not going to work for the people and for the people, the American workers, let's shut it down.
The question, though, is how do people protect themselves? It seems that if you have
uh,
corporate control of
yeah,
everything directly, and now you don't
those,
have the facade, get rid of the government, just have the corporations in charge. You have a
well,
corporate state without any facade of democracy. This is what the cabinet of Trump is, billionaire corporate executives. Elon Musk, who did such a good job of safety at the Tesla plant at Fremont that they covered up injuries during COVID, and he was telling the workers, don't worry about COVID. It's all okay. And they were becoming a vector because workers couldn't afford to live in the Bay Area. They were transported to the Central Valley. They infected the Central Valley with the COVID, and many people died there. It seems like this out of control situation is going to lead to even greater calamities for the working people and the people of this country and the world, actually.
if the people want to govern, the people have to stand up and demand the power to govern. And as long as the people remain silent, hiding under their desk or whatever they're doing, they're not in control. They have no influence. You cannot get there without organization. which means you have to have other people. The American people individually are not going to get anything done. This is why voting isn't the answer. It's a systemic corruption. And the only way you can get at systemic corruption is have the people who are subject to the system stand up and say, okay, we're not going to do this anymore.
And it seems like we're going more and more in that direction.
Yes, I think so. Why would you trust Congress, the broken branch, by their own admission, the broken branch, or the federal administrative state, its chief executive? And when was the last time we had a chief executive that actually stood up for the people?
That was what was striking about Vance, J.D. Vance, coming to East Palestine, because many of the people there had supported him. They had hopes that he would come there with something to say to them about getting health care, about getting money to relocate from poisoned homes. These are complicated things. You can't just snap your fingers.
But we can begin the process, can't we, JD?
There have been many executive orders that they've issued. In fact, they're issuing executive orders every day. They can't have an executive order for the people of East Palestine who can't get health care as a result of losing their jobs and not being able to work, who can't move out of their homes because they're poisoned and they don't have enough money to move out, so they and their families are stuck in these homes.
This is my opinion. Take it for what it's worth. There's a crisis of governance going on here. And a lot of the smoke and mirrors that have gone on for decades are beginning to fail. And the American people are beginning to see the reality of what the government really is. So now you've got what Trump is doing. He, like Roosevelt, is trying to get ahead of the snowball. The people have come to a point where they're not going to accept this. So they have to figure out, we'll tell them this, we'll promise this, and we'll promise that, to try to calm everybody down, because they are afraid of the American people. They're afraid that you've woken this giant force, and they may decide that maybe they should take control. And that's what they fear. So Trump's job, because he's part of the corporate state, is to try to give an appearance of reform. This is what Roosevelt, didn't he? He just didn't let people see that he was a corporate. He was one of the richest men in the United States, for God's sakes.
It's interesting because the billionaires have openly, Elon Musk and Zuckerberg, they're all up there with Trump. And he said he was going to fight for the common person, the regular person. And then he's got all the billionaires up front with him. And he puts Elon Musk, not from even South Africa, who actually illegally came to this country and was under student deferment at Stanford, and then is setting up his company. He could be deported under the laws. He came here illegally. And yet he puts Elon Musk in charge of the state.
Again, this is what Roosevelt did.
Well, Roosevelt faced a general strike. There was a general strike in 1934 in San Francisco and Minneapolis. Trump may provoke one. That's pretty clear, especially with the government being shut down in March. If there's a government shutdown, then these air traffic controllers who are stretched out, stressed out, might decide enough is enough and walk. And that happened during the last government shutdown, where people weren't being paid. Here you are working, required to work, but not being paid. I would say that's slave labor.
There is a big difference between the 1930s and now. And that is the American empire is collapsing. We all know that. That's not even controversial to say that. And they're trying to sort out, how do we keep it all going? And that's the problem. They don't have the power and control they once did. So the pressure to perform is there, but they don't have the tools to do a lot of this stuff.
But isn't that when fascism comes?
I don't know. Fascism, I would argue that if you look at the American state, it's a corporate state. What's the definition of fascism?
Fascism means that instead of having a facade of bourgeois democracy, capitalist
Right.
democracy, you have the capitalists directly in charge,
Yes.
instituting whatever they want without any kind of legislation or Congress. And basically, at this point in the history of the United States, we have a situation in which whole departments are being shut down. Money that has been appropriated by Congress is not being spent for what it was appropriated for. And you have a situation in which the workers, the privatization, for example, of Medicare, the privatization of Social Security, turned over to private capitalists and increasing the profit, the drive for profit of these corporations. And that, I think, is a major development right now, that in cryptocurrency, the need for profit, even from financial speculation, turning our Federal Reserve into cryptocurrency, or the reserves. This is a crisis of a system that can no longer function as it was functioning. So they have to have a different form. And using the military, trying to tell the military that they don't know what they're doing. It seems like the conditions for a fascist state, a fascist government, already exist and are in place.
Yes, I think that's the point I'm trying to make here. When I look at the government and I see organized crime, it means that there's no longer even a pretense of some kind of social democracy. And I think that's what people are beginning to finally understand. They went from talking about Republicans and Democrats to now it's the uniparty. Welcome to the world. Yes, it is the will. What is the uniparty? It's the corporate party. So regardless of whether you vote for a Democrat or a Republican, you get the same thing. There is no democracy in America, not in the sense that people have actual power. They can play the game. You can go into the casino, but all of the tables are rigged.
And there is no working class party. People really don't have a political alternative. As you say, you vote for the Republicans, you get the same policies as the Democrats. People who voted in East Palestine for Vance and Trump, thinking that they would get some justice, they would get some accountability with Norfolk Southern, are being told by Vice President Vance, I don't have time. 2 years is a long time ago, and we can't really institute the Stafford Act. We can't declare this a mass casualty incident site, because he said, we want to get Norfolk Southern to give $16 million to build a fire training facility so that it can train people for more wrecks, more derailments.
Yeah, let's not cure the disease. Let's just hire a corporate entity to treat it.
But like trained firemen to fight more derailments in Ohio and the Midwest for these railroad companies, and they won't do it. So he's begging them. Vance is begging Norfolk Southern to give them more money to build a training center so that they can fight more fires that happen as a result of wrecks in that area, as well as the deregulation of these railroads.
Did anybody mention the fact that who's responsible for maintaining the right-of-way, railroad right-of-way? The federal government.
The Federal Railway Act, FRA.
Exactly. And if
he also said we need more technology on the trains. They want automated trains without any workers. In fact, they want to get rid of workers on the locks in the Midwest.
Will that fix the track? No. That's a very expensive job. And they've been given away to the railroads are one of the oldest, most corrupt entities in the United States. You go back to the Credit Mobilier scandal in the 1860s. What was that about? That was about the railroad oligarchs trying to get the federal government to foot the bill for constructing a transcontinental railroad. And at the end of the day, what was the deal? Oh, yeah. What we'll do is we'll give you property, alternate section along the right of way. Gee, what happened in that right of way? That's where the towns were created. That's where the big farms and factories would set up shop because they're right next to the railroad. And so the railroad, at one point back in the 70s, when I was looking at the SP in California, the SP was the largest single agricultural landholder in California. And they were running a scam where their stuff, their farms, corporate farms, would pay high rates. No, let me get that straight. The farms that weren't there, they would be paying high rates for transporting their goods. But of course, since they're part of the same corporation, the SP farms were basically paying nothing. That's monopoly. That's a monopoly practice that basically was designed to run small farmers out of business.
And North Dakota, the Farmer Labor Party, as a result
Yeah.
of the railroads and the banks, they were doing the same thing, and the banks.
Worse, what SP was doing, SP was getting money on top of this from the Congress because they were saying, oh, the rate, we can't charge enough for our rates to maintain the track and all. We need subsidies. And so they were getting it from both sides.
That's the history of the United States.
There you go. That goes back 170 years to the scandal in the 1860s.
And here you have, this epitomizes it. I mean, the David Sachs, who helped Vance get elected and had Vance at his dinner at his mansion in San Francisco, $45 million mansion, is it big into cryptocurrency. They funded Vance in Ohio. I think millions of dollars they gave him to get elected senator. And as the people's man from West Virginia.
What people?
Yeah.
Tell me, identify those people.
He gets into hedge funds and then he comes back and he can't fight Norfolk Southern. They're too big. He's going to ask for money for a training center for firemen to help out East Palestine. And they won't
That's
give
called
him that.
whitewash. That's whitewash. That's exactly what whitewash looks like.
A training facility for firefighters. That's what he was complaining about. And they wouldn't give him the money. They had promised the money for a training center for firefighters in East Palestine. But the people there who don't have health care, who are getting sick, them and their families, are stuck in their homes and they can't get out. And he said, it's very complicated getting things done for people.
Yeah, this is all the same. This is the same that's been going on for 150 years, folks. Get a clue.
Healthcare, they can't even get healthcare for people in this country. And one of the things RFK Jr. was saying that he supports Medicare Advantage, privatization of Medicare. So you can turn more of Medicare, all of it, over to private companies to make more profit.
One of the things what I see looking at the big picture in the US at this point, a couple of things really come out at me. Number one, they've lost their empire. The people who made their fortunes because of the empire and exploiting all those folks around the world are going to have to look for new people to support them. And third, you've got a big split in the political class between finance capitalists, the banks, basically, and particularly the international banks, and the mainstream capitalists who depend on people being able to buy the products that they make. Henry Ford did that one really well. There's a big split between them. And what's happening in that split is light is shining into the system and exposing what it is.
And of course, with AI, getting rid of workers, I know Goldman Sachs did a study that 350 million workers will lose their job with the introduction of AI, artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence. If there's nobody to buy the products,
right?
How do you make a profit?
This is a big problem for them, isn't it?
In California here, you have autonomous vehicles. They want autonomous trucks to get rid of millions of truck drivers. It seems like capitalism is saying, we don't need you, the working class, anymore, but we want to keep in control.
Back in the day, there were rumbles about a revolution in the 30s. And one thing Roosevelt understood was, let's see, what can we do about that? Let's give them the 40-hour work week. All of the industrial sociologists I've known over the last 40 years, they all say the same thing. Most people only work 20 hours a week at their job because after 4 hours, people simply stop functioning well. Really, you could cut the work week in half and you would actually increase productivity. That's not my opinion. That's the opinion of sociologists, industrial sociologists, who have studied the workplace for the last 50 years. If we've got AI, what's the rational solution that serves the American people, the working class? The solution is, why don't we lower the work week, maintain wages at the same level or higher, lower the work week to 20 hours, and get the benefits of the technology to the working class? Why shouldn't they build the damn thing?
Well,
Building
that
this.
would be the development of technology for the use of the working class. The Industrial Revolution, the technology was developed for the capitalists to get rid of
Exactly. Time to
workers.
change that.
I remember computers when they came to Silicon Valley, they said they were going to free people from menial labor. You're going to be free. You won't have to do menial jobs anymore. The
You
computer
just
will
won't have
take
any
care of
job at all.
it. And now with the computer and the cell phones, you're tethered to the phone and you're working 24 hours a day. People sleeping in their cars working 3 or 4 jobs. The exploitation, the intensification of exploitation with the development of technology is massive.
Yep,
So you
yep,
have a
absolutely.
growing rebellion. What is the technology for? And it's for increasing the profits of,
Yes,
and in China, you have the automated docks. The docks are automated. You have factories now that don't need workers. This is a crisis
it is a
because
crisis,
they're not
but
reducing the
the
working.
crisis is easily solved, isn't it? In a practical sense, there is no crisis. It's just a matter of redistributing the work that's available,
And
along with
neither the Democrat,
relatively higher income.
that's true, but neither the Democrats or the Republicans are interested in that kind of redistribution because all the
Oh,
oligarchs are up there. But then the Republicans said, you just spent $1.5 billion on your campaign for
And how much
the
is
election. A
Barack
billion and a half
Obama
dollars?
worth after growing up poor and all this? How much is he worth? $100 billion or something like that? But he's not an oligarch, is he?
It seems that this crisis, this collapse of capitalism, of imperialism, the growing contradictions, which you have seen in your effort to expose what's going on in the state with oversight of OSHA and other agencies, now present to the working class that they need a different system really to survive.
Yes,
And that
yes.
becoming more and more apparent. Yet there is no working class party. There's no labor party. There's no party that has a program to say, let's reduce the work week to 20 hours and deal with technology, that the benefits of technology should go to the people,
Absolutely.
not to the
The people that's
billionaires.
building it, they forget. It's the people that's building it. They pretend that somehow this is happening by magic. No, it's
And,
not.
and they use people, even in these autonomous vehicles, they use people all over the world building them. But one of the things about the autonomous vehicle, which Newsom has covered up and unregulated, and they want to bring in the crew, Elon Musk wants to bring in his cars, is that if there's a earthquake in California, for example, it will shut down the internet or the Wi-Fi. All these vehicles will shut down. If you're in the middle of a city, all the vehicles stopped. And that
Right.
happened in San Francisco when there was a big concert and the Everybody was using the Wi-Fi. 10 of these vehicles, Waymo cars shut down in North Beach in the middle of the street. In Chinatown, one of them was burned. It stopped, people burned it up. But this crisis of the drive for profit from AI, from technology over the health and safety of the people is becoming more and more apparent. In other words, drive this use of autonomous vehicles, regardless of the dangers to the people in a major earthquake. And then you have, of course, the climate crisis.
About that one, I did my PhD on that one. I'll tell you, there is no climate crisis. There is none. That's another corporate project. There is, in the sense that climate change has been around for 4 billion years, that has been encountered many times in human history. And what we do as humans is we adapt.
The development of global warming, and that is a fact, that the Earth is getting warmer. And, for example, in the ocean, the heat of the ocean, we just had this hurricane that went through the middle of Florida. There's an increase in these hurricanes and these kind of incidents. And you look at what's going to happen this coming summer.
And this is what I'm saying is these kinds of climate changes have occurred many times in the past and many times during the human history. And what happens is humans adapt. And you adapt in terms of your habitat, you adapt in terms of your agriculture, you adapt in terms of your transportation. All of these things are adaptations. But what they want to do is they want to capture the reality of climate change and employ it to promote authoritarian, corporate-driven behavior. And that's the problem. Why are people living in places where they're at risk of flood? Who gets flooded in a flood? It's the people who live in the lowest land. And why are they there? Because they're poor and they can't afford to live on the hill. That's what goes on. The people who are at risk are the working class people and the poor people who can't afford to live in a place that is more insulated against these natural disasters.
In the case of California, the situation of fires.
Yeah.
This recent fire in Los Angeles, Malibu, it wasn't only poor people that were.
No, this is the hubris of the whole thing. Yes. Why were those people living in not Malibu? They're living there because they like the view. And I can't believe for an instant that these people, as wealthy as they were, didn't know the risk. How many fires like this have occurred in my lifetime? I can remember the one in 73, and they've happened reoccurring every 10 years. The difference was this one happened to occur in the conjunction with a very dry period. And most of the time you get these kind of fires, they happen in the fall, September, October, maybe November.
The fire season now is all year long, though. That is a change.
Yeah, but the point is, I can't believe people would have, build a multi-million-dollar house in brush. This is this creosote brush, but a brush that has an ignition temperature of about 2,000 degrees. If you're going to build something, this is just, to me, a lot of this is their own negligence. Yes, the state played a big part, but they put the freaking house there in the first place.
And they were allowed to do that. The developers control. The developers run the cities and run the
premium price. You get the view of the sunset over the Pacific. A lot of this is lack of real critical thinking. And there's been very little to encourage critical thinking in the American population. It's much more about control. It's much more about manipulation of knowledge. And people don't have their own agency. A lot of people end up in places that they never would imagine they would be. And they don't realize how much risk there is. Hunter's Point is exactly one of those cases. Who's moving into those apartments out there that they're going to build in Hunter's Point? Are they being told, oh, by the way, there's a toxic waste dump right at your doorstep?
Willie Brown, when he was mayor of San Francisco, as part of the agreement with Lennar, the developer, when they took over its development, agreed to pay for a environmental engineer, Amy Brunel, at that time, and she still may be working for the city and county of San Francisco. Her salary is paid for by the Lennar Corporation.
Oh, really?
And when people had questions about whether they should buy their condos, the city hall would send them to Amy Brownell, who would tell them it's all okay. Don't worry about any problems. I'm an environmental engineer. She didn't
Well,
say she was paid for by the Lennar Corporation, which was the developer of the Hunters Point condos, which is a great view, but on a radioactive dump site.
that's my job. You've got to think for yourself. You've got to do your own work. You can't rely on public officials or corporate officials to tell you the truth because it's not in their interest to tell you the truth. You're going to have to go out there and do the heavy lifting to find out what's actually going on. I know there are good people out there at Hunters Point that know the story. They should be going to them, not to the company, for Christ's sake, and the government.
And the developers.
These people are one and the same.
Lurie, the new mayor, is a billionaire scion of the Levi Foundation, who's a
Yeah,
privatizer and nonprofit. So he's continuing that and wants to get rid of any oversight and make everything a nonprofit, get rid of public workers and bring in nonprofits controlled by the billionaires.
let me conclude with this. It's really easy to see. The Trump administration has 100 days. And if they don't show substantial improvement in things in 100 days, they're toast politically. The Democrats, who are just completely, they know that the 100-day cycle is now ongoing, and they're going to do everything they can to ruin the 100 days for Donald Trump. That's suicide because the people aren't going to run back to the Democrat Party. It's imploding. They're just going to succeed in destroying the political class itself.
And that's probably what they're both afraid of. This internecine warfare in the capitalist class is leading to the destruction of both and giving rise to the potential of a real working class political alternative for people in the United States.
This is true, absolutely true. And I wonder, there's a lot of people who are invested in Donald Trump. A lot of them didn't even vote for the guy, but they're invested in the idea that he's going to make everything better, make America great again. Tell me, when was America great in the first place? They know things are bad. They know there are really serious risks in the world. And they're hoping against hope that he's actually going to do this job and get this stuff done. Ain't going to happen, folks. The Democrats will destroy the world before they let that happen.
And I think we've seen that in East Palestine, when people had hope that Vance, who was from that area, would actually defend them, and they discovered, to their chagrin, that wasn't the case.
Yep.
Promises. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Darrel Whitman. He was a OSHA inspector investigator in San Francisco and took up a fight to defend whistleblowers, was retaliated against, and joined with other whistleblowers, federal and private whistleblowers throughout the United States, and discovered that, in fact, the system was corrupt, and both parties really are part of a system to cover up these issues.